And he tells you tonight that we are facing this attack on the rule of law that is different. That this is not, sometimes there are crimes and sometimes there are people in office who have been caught committing crimes in both parties, as he was careful to note. But this is something different. We have just that short bit. I don't know if it jumped out to you in the moment, but let's listen to that for your response.
I think we are facing an attack on the rule of law that is different in kind and scope to anything I've seen in my lifetime.
What does that mean to you, that he wants us to know that?
Well, look, in some ways, there's so much gaslighting in our politics, and there's so much sort of a attempt to intimidate people covering the facts as we see them with our own eyes, that it was reassuring that he sees what we see and what we cover, and that from his extraordinarily high perch inside the department and with all of his years of experience, he views it as dire as I do. It was, I would say, equally striking that when I asked him, if you were looking at our country and just assessing it in terms of whether the rule of law were alive or dead, is it still alive? He said, absolutely. I mean, that he knows of sort of more pockets, I guess, the things that aren't in the headlines inside the department that are still, and he said, they're not throwing sand in the gear. They're not part of the resistance. They're just in there doing their job. But then he did say, I said, but what if doing their job, ran afoul of Mr. Blanche or others? And he said, yeah, well, that would be the fork in the road. I mean, what was interesting to me is that it is both as bad as it looks from the outside, that weaponization is the central organizational theory for the Department of Justice, that the examples that he lifted up were Danielle Sassoon, that's who he was talking about there at the end, who left over the perfectly predicated case against Eric Adams, the folks who have, left before bringing the cases against Jim Comey, Eric Siebert, and others, the people in Minnesota he mentioned who refused to investigate family members of a shooting victim. What is, I think, still... I think the work for people like us is to do what he's talking about, to lift up the people who are sort of paying the price of their life's work, of people who grow up and want to do this work are some of the very ones who rose to the top. And those ones at the top were the ones that worked on his cases. So I think I had a greater appreciation for the loss of experience, the loss of the cream of the crop, right? The people that have been purged were not necessarily the first agents in. They were the best of the best, the ones who understood the sensitive nature of the cases against Donald Trump, the ones who had enough clearances to even work on the Mar-a-Lago documents case. He couldn't say anything about that one, and didn't bite when I asked him if he thought Aileen Cannon would be nominated to the Supreme Court. But I think it was both reassuring that he sees the direness of the moment, the way you and I think largely cover it. And it was ominous to think about all the experience that's been axed for political purpose from the Bureau and the department.
For the first time, the first prosecutor to ever indict a president, Jack Smith, who ultimately did it twice because he said the evidence supported it, speaking out in his first journalistic interview, including about those controversial January 6 pardons.
What do you say about the facts that you developed that you see? I know you don't watch a ton of news, but you see enough to know that the basic principle of recidivism likely applies to the election case. The things that you charged are a lot of the same kinds of stories we cover. What is the cost of someone not being held accountable for their crimes?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about the pardons of these people convicted for the violence on January 6th, right? There's all sorts of costs. There's the obvious cost of just recidivism. These are people who committed their crimes in the name and in the interest of Donald Trump, and he's returned the favor, right, by pardoning them. That sends one message to them. A message I'm equally concerned about is the message that it sends to law enforcement. Supporting law enforcement should not be a political issue.
Jack Smith speaking forthrightly there on 2 points. The second, as you heard, is that Donald Trump sided with violent criminals over police, that he is an anti-police president. The pardon is a power that the president constitutionally has. No one is saying that it was itself illegal. Smith is saying, however, that it is anti-police, anti-law enforcement. The first point he made was admittedly a little more legalistic. He referred to recidivism. What he's saying in plain English is, if you let people get away with it, they'll do it again. And that maybe Donald Trump wants to do it again, to have another violent insurrection or other violent crime committed on his behalf. Recidivism is why you have strong penalties and deterrence under the law, something that prosecutors like Smith basically devote their lives to. And he's saying, for the first time in the modern era, it's the president undercutting that on behalf of criminals. He also spoke about the midterms.
I'm very concerned of what's going to happen in the next election, absolutely.
Do you see, again, in things that are covered and things that are public-facing, conduct ahead of the midterms that you investigated on in the January 6th case?
Well, I've been thinking about it more in terms of what needs to be done based on what we saw happen last time. And, it's a different situation now based on, the people who perpetrated January 6th have probably learned from how they did that. My personal view is I think the state attorney generals have a tremendous role to play here. They can make sure the rule of law functions in their state. And I would also say that I think a thing that all of us can do is support election workers and election officials. The last time around, we saw that those people stood firm, and they were, in many cases, the difference. It's clear to me, anyways, that what I've seen publicly, that those people are going to be put under great pressure. And my experience, not only just as special counsel, but, I was the chief of the public integrity section at the Department of Justice for 5 years, had a number of cases with election officials. These are people also, they're not tooting their own horn. They're not self-promoters. They just care about our democracy. We need to show them that we have their back.
Smith speaking out clearly there in this new MS Now exclusive interview. When he mentions the public integrity section, which has been, of course, completely decimated under Donald Trump, that's the part of the DOJ that deals with the important but sensitive cases of anti-corruption and potentially indicting or prosecuting lawmakers, politically connected individuals, important politicians. To run that section, you have to have kind of the gold standard of being evidence-based, nonpartisan, and having integrity. It's kind of the fulcrum of pressure inside the DOJ. And when he was there, for example, he pursued famously a case against Democrat John Edwards because he said the evidence supported it. And ultimately, as we know, concluded that there was enough evidence to go after Donald Trump. I mentioned a case of a Democrat and a Republican. So when Smith then now draws on that credibility and his entire career to assess the so-called enemies list or some of the cases that the Trump DOJ has brought on his personal demand, it comes with great credibility. Most people may only know Smith from prosecuting Trump, and that might even overweight how you look at him. But he is kind of, like I'm telling you, the legal gold standard for these cases. So when he says, as we just learned he did, I'm going to play you the excerpt, that so many of them lack any merit, that is kind of the ultimate slam dunk against some of the Trump DOJ's revenge cases. Take a look.
I, from my perspective, have seen a number of cases. James Comey, Letitia James, Jerome Powell, right? There's not criminality here. Seashells? So the only reasonable explanation is the president has it out for these people, and he has people who are his former personal lawyers who are going to do what he says, regardless of the factual law.
Going after people regardless of the law will get you a lot of trouble in court, might get your case tossed. And if some of those folks are doing it knowingly, below the legal standard of what it takes to indict someone, they could be disbarred or worse. Jack Smith, again, the expert on that. So that's not nothing. And for those who say, well, when is it going to matter? Well, it could matter very soon if Congress changes hands, and it could matter a lot in just over 2 years if the White House and DOJ changes hands. He's sort of telling you how it is tonight. Now, I want to just remind everyone, we are here in an extraordinary place. A few years ago, it would have been unthinkable that a prosecutor would be on television talking about not one but two federal cases against a former president. It had never happened before. So let's remember how we got here, because what started out with lawsuits turned ultimately into the insurrection in the 2020 plots. Some of them we've marked for you green or yellow because they were effectively legally allowed. But as Trump got more desperate and those things didn't work, when you get to the Congress overturning votes, the requests on Pence, the aborted plan to have a military plot or coup, and then ultimately the final arrow we all know, the illegal sabotage of January 6th. Those were the plots that accrued. And Smith ultimately was tapped as one of these special counsels with extra independence to pursue them. And as you know, I'll remind you, as we plotted this, he indicted many of them and won convictions against, we saw at the state level, over the overlapping plots. The federal cases, of course, were truncated by the Supreme Court.